It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
It's a bit of chaos at the minute, right, isn't it? There's lots of people fighting with each other in the Conservative Party. There are defections going on. If they're fighting with each other like rats in a sack, instead of saying to the public, this is what we're going to do for you, that doesn't win elections.
The fallout from the political defection no one could have predicted.
My stance on immigration and refugees and asylum seekers, for example, has always been completely different to Natalie. I'm not sure what that means now about Labour's view on those things. Is it me or is it hers?
The former Home Secretary had this advice for the Prime Minister on Sunday.
He needs to take us out of the European Convention on Human Rights. That's how you actually send the message that he's serious about stopping the vote.
But Shami Chakrabarti says we need human rights laws more than ever. And the row about calls to boycott Eurovision over the Israel-Gaza conflict. Joining me to discuss all that, Conservative MP Sir Jake Berry, Labour peer Shami Chakrabarti, political editor of Times Radio Kate McCann and political editor of The Mirror John Stevens. This is Politics Live. Let's start the programme with this story, an article penned by Conservative MP Ian Duncan-Smith. The Telegraph headline, "Dangerous cyclists are a lawless menace. Parliament must act or I fear the growing number of electric bikes will only see more pedestrians killed." He isn't just talking about electric bikes, and he does cite a number of cases where pedestrians have been killed by cyclists and saying it's very difficult to prosecute. He would like an amendment to the Criminal Justice Bill for a new offence causing death by careless, dangerous or inconsiderate cycling. Should the law be changed?
Well, I actually agree with him. I mean, I'm a multi-road user. I cycle, I drive and I do a lot of walking as well. And I do think particularly these electric bikes, they're dangerous, they're relatively new. It seems like a reasonable updating of the current law. There are laws already to tackle people who cycle dangerously. I don't know the last time someone was prosecuted for drunk in charge of a bicycle, but that is a specific offence. Look, the way people get around is changing, and it's right that the law sort of keeps up to date with that. So I think Ian's definitely got a point.
Do you think he's right? I mean, the article does detail how hard it is to get a prosecution in these cases, but does the law need to be changed?
I think he may have a point. I've read the article, I haven't done tons of independent research, but I don't think he would be one for unnecessary legislation, but there does appear to be a gap. Manslaughter is at one end of the spectrum,
yes,
and not everyone is drunk who's causing a problem. We want more people to be cycling, but we want them to be responsible, right?
But isn't that part of the point, though? Because this cycling revolution we've seen in our major cities, it's something we should all celebrate. It's a huge success.
Yes.
But if the law hasn't kept up to date, I think Shami's right that this is something Parliament should be looking at in both houses.
But sharing streets is sometimes a dangerous thing, potentially, with bikes on the streets and sometimes on the pavements too. But as you say, we want to encourage more people to have a healthy lifestyle. What do you think about changing the law?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ian Duncan-Smith is right. There is a gap here, and it is that legislation just hasn't kept up with the way that people are living their lives. And I think it's not just about electric bikes, but that is it's a really worthwhile thing to highlight here, because I cycle in London, and often people on electric bikes will cut you up on a cycle lane. They will cut across you at a junction. They are often...
On the pavement?
Often on the pavement. And that, Ian Duncan-Smith says particularly, there was an incident outside a school where children were waiting to get into the school and someone on an electric bike had almost knocked some kids over. And that's clearly not something that should be allowed to happen. So, yeah, I think he probably does have a point here, but that bill already has a fair amount of stuff in it. So
everybody's adding amendments all the time. Do you think it'll get anywhere?
Well, I think I'm generally quite sympathetic to cyclists. I quite often cycle into work, but there are quite a lot of plonkers who also cycle around, and a lot of them are people on these rental bikes that some of them now do have electric power in them. That I think if it's not your bike, for some reason people, not only do they leave them on roads and pavements blocking places, they do seem to be a bit more careless when it's not their own bike. Yesterday when I was walking to work, I mean, admittedly I was walking on a pavement glued to my mobile phone, not looking where I was going.
Everyone's glued to their mobile.
But then a cyclist on one of these bikes came the other way, it almost knocked me over and then had the cheek to swear at me. And I just thought, well, you're the who should be not on the
road user,
pavement.
but I think what's quite interesting, this probably won't become law because this bill is a bit of a Christmas tree, and the government will. There's all sorts of pet projects hung onto it, and the government will resist it. By putting this amendment down, Ian will start the debate, and whoever forms the next government, this may be something they seek to revisit, and we will have had the opportunity already to discuss the validity of Ian's arguments or not. I think they're quite well made, actually, in this article in Parliament. That's how laws change. It's not, I've had an idea, I'll change a bit of legislation, it will happen. Well, it's an iterative process.
Well, as you say, whoever forms the next government is a perfect point at which to move on and talk about that rather high profile and dramatic defection yesterday, which did surprise everybody. Yes, Natalie Elphicke, the Dover MP, former Conservative, has defected to Labour. A huge blow to Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, to lose a second MP to the opposition, and also because Natalie Elphicke's statement was excoriating about the Prime Minister and the Conservatives in general. Well, let's listen to Ben Houchin, who you will remember is the re-elected Mayor of Tees Valley for the Conservatives. He had this to say.
Of people who are involved in the problems with the Conservative Party. I mean, it's a bit of chaos at the minute, right? Isn't it? There's lots of people fighting with each other in the Conservative Party. There are defections going on, and ultimately the public do not vote for parties who are not united and are not presenting a united front, and also aren't talking to the public. If they're fighting with each other like rats in a sack, instead of saying to the public, this is what we're going to do for you, that doesn't win elections. So obviously it ultimately lies with Rishi, but there are lots of people who need to get their act together, stop messing about and start talking to the public about what they can offer them rather than just fighting with each other.
Ben Houchin saying that Conservatives are fighting like rats in a sack. Well, that's certainly what the electorate think.
Well, that's obviously how Ben perceives it. What I think is really interesting about his election result is it does show for Conservatives that there is a brand of conservatism, boosterism, Johnsonism, Sunakism. Sunak was as much part of levelling up as Boris Johnson, or Houchinism, that is still popular with the public. And Ben is absolutely right to say, stop this nonsense that we see in Westminster and get on talking about the really good things we are doing for communities across the UK, but particularly where I represent in the north of England, where that's a £125 million town deal in Darwin, with three brand new secondary schools in Rosendale.
But what is it then that drove Natalie Elphicke into the arms of Labour?
Well, Natalie Elphicke, in her time in Parliament, has done lots of things that I've been scratching my head about her time here. I thought it was unusual, some bizarre comments she gave after her husband had been convicted of sexually assaulting a woman. She said it was because he was charismatic, wealthy and a man. She's made lots of funny decisions that I don't understand. This is just another one of them. But I also think it's really interesting.
But you let her stay in the Conservative Party, not you personally, but she stayed in the Conservative.
It wasn't up to me personally, but to look at the
Did you voice those
motivation.
Did you voice those concerns?
About Natalie?
Yeah.
Well, look, I voiced lots of concerns about lots of things when I was chairman, but they must remain confidential. But what I think it does say is, in relation to Keir Starmer, a really bad error of judgment, I think, on his behalf. Firstly, because Natalie and I were in the same lobby voting to strengthen the Rwanda bill together. That's at odds with the official position of the Labour Party. I wonder how Shami feels about being in the same political party, but he is known for this.
But hang on, you say you felt uncomfortable, let's put it that way, or you were scratching your head about comments that she made after her husband...
I just say I struggled to understand them.
If you think it's a bad error of judgment for the Labour Party, but it wasn't a bad error of judgment for the Conservative Party to hold on to it.
The Conservative Party is a broad... No,
well,
sorry. If you let me answer the question, that would be helpful. But so the Conservative Party is a broad church. There are people in the ERG who are on the right of the Conservative Party who can happily sit within the wider Conservative family. I'm not sure that the Labour Party's church is quite that broad. It would be quite unusual for them to have an ERG member.
Well,
I just say on her decision making. First of all, what I actually said is I've slightly bemused by many decisions she made, but also my sort of overriding view is that when times get tough, often weak people no longer stand by what they believe in. So I suggest it's weak of her to leave, and actually very weak of Keir Starmer to accept someone into his party who has such different views than his MPs.
Well,
it's good to have heard the liberal conscience of the nation through
what about the liberal conscience within the Labour Party?
So what I think is that I believe people can change their minds. I believe that there can be a change of heart. for me, it would have been perhaps a little smarter and more sensitive, despite the great irresistible coup of having your opponent sit behind the leader at PMQs. I would have liked perhaps to have heard the in-depth interview with Natalie Elphicke, with a seasoned, neutral journalist who, wouldn't beat her up, but would let her explain the change of heart and the change of mind. I think that might have been smarter campaigning and smarter politics.
I don't think she has changed
if
her
I
mind.
could have my turn.
But I was going to.
If I could have my turn.
Yeah, but has she changed her mind?
Well, I don't. I mean, this is what I'm intrigued to hear about, rather than sitting in judgment. What I would say about the broad church point, because the two great political traditions in this country have traditionally been broad churches. I think you measure the breadth of the church from one wall to the other.
I'll get my tape measure out.
Right, and so what I would say is, if there is now a place for a changed Natalie Elphicke in the Parliamentary Labour Party, surely my friend Diane Abbott will have the whip restored quick smart.
And Jeremy Corbyn.
And that is something that I think I should be able to look forward to in this context of a broad church.
All right.
And people can be forgiven and people can change their minds.
And Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, I don't know what his intentions are and what the latest state of discussions is.
But he's still a member of the Labour Party.
Well, if he's well, there you. I mean, the point is the point, isn't it? Whether it's, I mean, Diane is my particular preoccupation,
right?
Not least because of the Marcus Rashford comments.
On
and
the back of what you've said, Shami, do you need to know and hear from Natalie Elphicke herself or Keir Starmer saying that she has changed her mind on issues of immigration? I mean, she was staunchly pro-Brexit, a member of the European Research Group. She's repeatedly criticised Labour for being soft. Yeah, fair enough, for being soft on migration, untrustworthy on Brexit and running the economy. Those are her accusations of Labour. You would like to see evidence that she's sort of changed her mind on all these things?
I'm not sitting as judge and jury, not least because she's not standing as a Labour candidate, and effectively she's voted with her feet. She's going to be voting Labour at the very least at the next election. But on the immigration point, I think she cited immigration chaos and lack of control of the borders as one aspect, alongside housing, of her defection. So does she now realise, for example, that the Stop the Boats stunt is doing nothing to stop the boats? It's actually just stopping the courts and part of a journey to take us out of the European Convention. Has she changed her mind? Has she sat down, for example, with Keir Starmer's advisors? What is the journey? I'm intrigued. I'm interested.
But you'd like to see an interview along those lines.
Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you like to do the interview?
I'd love to do the interview. In fact, we could all do the interview, couldn't we? I mean, listening to this, were there reservations, Kate, within the Labour Party before this happened?
Yeah, there were reservations. The Chief Whip expressed concern, in fact. There was only a very small number of people who were aware that this was going to happen before it officially happened. And Labour's Chief Whip did raise an eyebrow and said, you might want to stop and think twice about this. Now, my understanding is that his concern was what Shami's talking about. Some of her views, previous views on immigration, for example, the fact that most people in the Tory party would say themselves that they are more left-wing than she is. I think Labour's calculation here was that they could explain that away, and actually it gives them an opportunity to say, well, look, if somebody like Natalie Elphicke is willing to join Labour, then this is an opportunity for others to think about it. But what I would say is the thing that they didn't calculate, and the politics of this that they didn't appreciate, is that there are lots of MPs within Labour who are deeply, deeply uncomfortable about things she has previously said about her husband and actually about how she got that seat.
Right. As you say, it was messy. Let's put it like that. And we'll go into some of the comments that she actually made in just a moment. But actually, those who are unhappy or have some level of unease include the former Labour leader Neil Kinnock, who was speaking to Radio 4's The Week in Westminster programme. This is what he said about Natalie Elphicke's defection.
I think we've got to be choosy to a degree about who we allow to join our party, because it's a very broad church, but churches have walls, and there are limits.
There are limits, says Neil Kinnock. On the other hand, it is a coup, isn't it, for the Labour Party, to use Shami's words. Were you surprised by the level of unease that's been expressed?
I was surprised that she was defecting to Labour. I mean, I must admit, yesterday, just before Prime Minister's questions, when got a message tipping me off that she was crossing the floor, my immediate response was to aware that I was surprised that she was going to the Labour Party. I think, though, for Keir Starmer, you can see the calculation that they've made. They realise that to win the election, you have to win over former Conservative voters. And having someone like Natalie Elphicke saying, I was a Conservative MP for quite a few years, and I've decided that Rishi Sunak is failing on issues like stopping the boats, and I think that is something quite helpful. As much as I'm surprised, actually, on Rwanda, when we were talking about how she changed her mind on Rwanda, actually, at the end of last year, when you were all doing your 5 families stuff, she did say that she thought the Rwanda scheme was failed and that the government did need to move on to other options, such as tackling the gangs and speaking with the French. But I think there is something that is still remaining that lots within the Labour Party do want an explanation on, and that is, as Kate says, those comments about her husband.
There's time for that. There's time for that. So let's have this interview.
Do you think there'll be questions about the advisor role that she has been allegedly offered by the Labour Party? Because that's much more long-term than...
Well, actually, so you've raised it. Obviously, would that be acceptable if she's been offered an advisory role on housing, which was the other thing she cited in her statement, her defection statement?
Look, that's the second part of the piece. The first part is I'm intrigued to know about the journey, not least because it might take other people on the journey. If she now understands, for example, that you don't stop the boats with performative cruelty, but there are better things you can do that are more humane and more effective, then I think I want to hear that. On housing...
on the advisory role, if she's been offered an advisory role on housing.
I mean, I don't know the detail about her expertise in that area, but...
She was a very well-regarded housing lawyer before she came to Parliament.
Yes.
But it's just the sort of feeling of that, you know, she's been slightly bought off, I think.
Bought off with an unpaid job.
With an unpaid
come on,
job.
You don't really think she's defecting just because Labour said you might be able to help with housing policies some way along the line, do you?
Well, I don't. You never know where these unpaid roles lead to, do they?
OK, fine. I mean, look, you're almost doing what I would expect you to do, which is you're displaying hurt feelings about someone who's defected from your party. But I don't see any suggestion that she's standing for Parliament, that she's got a paid job. She is disappointed in Rishi Sunak. She is not alone. It is right that we welcome people who are disappointed, but I think it would be good now to hear more from her about her values and how they sit, not just with mine, but with millions of other people in the Labour movement.
Right, but to go back to the issue of Rwanda and stop the boats, I mean, John is right. Actually, when you drill down in terms of what she said and what she's done, she did back the bill, whipped, obviously, to do so. But let me just finish. Hang on. Let me just finish. Thank you, Sammy. Let me just finish on the basis that in her statement, again, what she says very clearly is she believes the Labour leader has a more compelling vision in terms of stopping the boats than Rishi Sunak.
So I think what she said in the statement, because you read out earlier, is that the approach to the government isn't tough enough on immigration, I think was the language she used. And also on the Rwanda bill, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I had thought that she was in the same lobby as me.
Rwanda was doomed.
Voting to toughen up the legislation.
Yeah.
So I just think it's really... I mean, look, we know Keir Starmer changes his mind about things. He campaigned twice to make Jeremy Corbyn the Prime Minister. He was in favour of nationalisation. Now apparently he's not, except for the railways. We know he sort of takes any position on anything in a desperate attempt to gain power. I just think it's really interesting. If our approach isn't tough enough, she's now joined the Labour Party. Apparently, if they have a plan, which I haven't seen if they have one. I know they keep saying they have a plan, but I haven't seen it.
All right.
It'd be really interesting to know if that plan is tougher than Rwanda, which appears to be what she was demanding.
Maybe that it works.
Or that it works might be tough, right?
John, any talk of any further defections? Let's just show your exclusive. Labour has already begun conversations with the next Tory MPs who could cross the floor. Is this going to happen on a regular basis?
So they've definitely started conversations, but yesterday people in Labour saying they were at a very early stage. And if something happens, it may be another 1 or 2 people. It's not going to be a flood of people. I mean, someone joked to me that we're certainly not going to see someone popping up next Wednesday again, that they have started speaking to people, but it's very, very early stages.
Right, you're smiling.
Well, I just say...
You're not one of them,
let's see
are you,
what
Jake?
happens. No, I'm not. I'm a Conservative and I would never leave my party. But really interesting. Let's see what your prediction comes to, because if it does happen next Wednesday...
I don't. No, it definitely won't happen.
It definitely won't. OK, well, we'll see. I'm very
clear on my prediction.
I'm very pleased to hear that.
Right. I mean, I said I would mention the comments, Kate, because some people have questioned whether an MP who, after her ex-husband's conviction for sexual assault, was reported to have said being attractive and attracted to women, which you also said, Jay, have made him an easy target, and this was in the trial, should be welcomed in the Labour Party. Will it, in the end, be a net positive or negative for the Labour Party to have this defection?
I suspect, actually, it just won't matter. I mean, if you look at the most recent polling today, Labour is 30 points ahead in the polls. I mean, there's very little... Yes, polls will narrow, but there's very little that's really going to shift that opinion at this point. But I think that is also why some in the Labour Party are questioning, well, did you actually need to do this? I mean, there is ambiguity there around... comments she made about Charlie Elphicke. There's ambiguity around her views on immigration and whether or not she's actually changed them. I think with Dan Poulter, he works in the NHS. He was, of course, the other Tory who defected. Works in the NHS, had quite a strong message to sell there.
There was a real story to tell.
There was a story.
And he had done work during the pandemic on vaccine patents and so on that, I was campaigning alongside him.
The problem here is that isn't quite so clear. And when you have another element to this story, which again is about how did she win the seat and her previous comments, it becomes muddy. That said, I think on both sides, actually, Tory MPs say it doesn't matter, Labour MPs are probably saying the same.
Right. I mean, it is about morale, though, isn't it, on both sides, in terms of whether they view this defection positively or negatively. What do you think it will be for the Labour Party after this?
I think probably within Westminster morale, it's not been particularly helpful. That I think that there are a lot of Labour backbenchers who aren't delighted about this, who have got questions about this, who might be slightly baffled. I think the key thing for Labour, though, is what does it do to the morale of the country and their thoughts about the Labour Party. And I think a lot of people in the country who aren't wise enough to tune into Politics Live, who aren't being wise enough to read all the things I write or that Kate puts on the radio, that a lot of them will have just heard a couple of sentences on a news bulletin, on a radio station playing music, which is just... Tory MP defects to Labour and says Rishi Sunak is failing to deal with immigration.
I repeat, let's take the opportunity and give the whip back to Diane Abbott. The broad church is complete.
Yes, and Kate Osamor's had the whip restored equally to the Labour whip. This story in BBC News, Jake, Nadeem Zahawi, former Chancellor, to stand down as Tory MP at election. Your reaction?
Well, I'm very sorry to see Nadeem go.
Surprised?
Not particularly surprised, because he, like me, has been in politics since 2010, and 14 years is a long time to do any job. I'm sorry to see him go. He's a charming, charismatic, good friend, and I think Parliament will be the poorer to not have him in it and not have his life experience. Let's not forget that he came to this country as a refugee, unable to speak English, has had an extraordinary life story, hugely successful in business and politics, and I think we need more people like Nadeem Zahawi in Parliament, not fewer.
Right, why are so many Conservatives standing down? I mean, I think it's the 104th overall, but the 64th Conservative. I mean, that is a significant number.
It is a significant number. I go back, we've been in power for 14 years. That's a long time. I talk to colleagues like Nadeem and other colleagues who are stepping down. A lot of them are saying, I haven't seen much of my family for a very long time. I can tell you I've got 3 kids. It is really difficult.
You are standing at the next election?
I'm 100%. I'm standing. But, it's really difficult. You spend... a lot of time away from your family, either in London or in in your constituency, and I just think that has a massive toll on people's lives, and that's why I'm not surprised that so many are stepping down after such a long period. Or
is it sort of have the end of an era feel about it, this election for Conservatives?
Yeah, hugely. I was talking to an MP yesterday who is, as Jake is, standing again. And he was saying, I don't know what my role is going to be. Am I going to sit on the back benches and try and argue about the future of the Tory party? Am I going to try and chair a select committee, but nobody's really going to listen to me? Or do I try and think about other projects elsewhere and sit it out for the next couple of years until the Tories are, an election-winning force again? I mean, that's obviously his hope. I think there is a bit of soul-searching going on, and that's part of the reason that you're seeing this conversation about Well, Suella Braverman saying we need to do this, that and the other, and John Hayes saying we need Suella Braverman back in the cabinet. It's this tussle over what is conservatism.
Yep.
And, you know, that's probably going to go on way past the next election.
But there's going to be a battle for the soul of the British Conservative Party after the next election, and it's not just of interest to Conservatives.
Well, let's talk about one of those battles in terms of human rights. The Guardian headline here, this is your book and this is your article, The Big Idea, Why We Need Human Rights Now More Than Ever. In an age of climate crisis and AI, equal treatment is nothing less than essential. Why have you written this book?
Because people aren't just debating this or that policy and whether it violates human rights anymore. People are debating whether we should have them at all. Now, I never thought that would be the case 30 years ago when I became a lawyer, but that is where we're at now, with people like Suella Braverman and even Rishi Sunak intimating the possibility of pulling out of the Strasbourg court. That would mean the Council of Europe. That's Churchill's legacy. I return to my previous point. This is a bipartisan post-war tradition that some people in Sir Jake's party are now planning to trash. And so I seek in this book to inform the debate, to talk a little bit about the history of human rights, not just after World War II, but throughout history, to suggest that it is universal, that it is essential, and then to maybe apply some of these human rights principles to the challenges of the age. Tech and AI, war and peace, and climate emergency.
Right, and Jake, you wrote this in December in the House magazine, leaving the European Convention on Human Rights would be good for Britain, diametrically opposed to what Shami Chakrabarti believes.
Well, I'm not quite diametrically opposed, because I read Shami's article. I thought it was a really good article. Actually, I agreed with virtually everything. I think you put in there that human rights need updating, they need to be ready for the modern day challenge. The reason I believe that we should leave the ECHR is I believe it is completely outdated. It was brought forward at the end of the Second World War to deal with a migrant crisis across Western Europe. We now, driven by all the things that Shami refers to in her article, I haven't read the book, but certainly the article, the global climate crisis, we have a global human rights and migration challenge, and I think the ECHR is outdated. That's why I believe a British Bill of Rights, which was in the Conservative Party's manifesto in 2019. I was elected on it.
I think it's been in repeatedly.
Yeah, well, so was David Cameron, elected on it as well, I believe, in 2010. A British Bill of Rights is the right thing to do for the United Kingdom. That doesn't mean it should be any lesser in terms of protections of citizens' rights than the ECHR. I would like to see more rights in there. I've written, not least in that article, saying the first thing I would like to see in a British Bill of Rights is the fact that we should have universal access to free healthcare, because I think the NHS is almost, or it should be, a human right in Great Britain.
Right, what's wrong with that, Shami?
Well, so it's very interesting, because as a point of information, the previous iterations of the Conservative policy for a British Bill of Rights did not involve pulling out of the ECHR. They involved replacing the Human Rights Act with a British Bill of Rights. So this is a new policy now that we're going to pull out of the Strasbourg Court and the Council of Europe that was Churchill's legacy. And by the way, there are currently interim measures from that court that order that the Russian Federation should not execute Ukrainian prisoners of war. We're going to walk out of that court's jurisdiction and that Council of Europe. I think that would be a tragic mistake and hypocrisy. You know, the key to the human rights kingdom is equal treatment, because otherwise my speech is free and yours is more expensive. You know, we practice human rights discipline, whether in politics or in the law, when we apply these rights to others.
There are lots of countries around the world, Shami, that have good records on human rights without being in the ECHR. No, Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada. Well, they have good records.
They are in other regional treaties. They are in other regional treaties instead.
We agree on. I actually think it's a very good article. I'd recommend that people go and see it. I just think that the ECHR is outdated. It's not fit for the modern global climate crisis and the global refugee crisis. I don't think that Britain. Particularly is incapable of governing her own Human Rights Act. And if we never changed any legislation, there'd still be people walking in front of cars with red flags.
You're actually arguably confusing the ECHR with the Refugee Convention. I would agree that the Refugee Convention probably needs an additional protocol or amendment to deal with climate refugees who don't all naturally sit within the current definition of a refugee. But the ECHR is free speech, fair trials, personal privacy.
But all of that could be covered in a British Bill of Rights. I'm not confusing the two.
But you don't want to be part of the Council of Europe mechanism. You don't want to. You don't accept the jurisdiction of the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg.
I think British judges should determine British laws.
In which case, why did you strip their jurisdiction in relation to the Rwanda legislation? You know, what's going on here is a sleight of hand. Rishi Sunak has defenestrated British courts by way of the Safety of Rwanda Act, and now refugee lawyers will have no choice but to go to Strasbourg, and then he'll say, foreign court, let's leave it.
Well, are you expecting it to be in the manifesto, leaving the ECHR?
No. It's interesting that Xavi says Jake stated out a new policy. I'm just a backbench MP. I'd be very surprised if it wasn't leaving the ECHR. I would like to see it, and I think we could have a really important debate about it.
Except Rishi Sunak has said, and I paraphrase here, that he will do everything, or everything will be on the table, I think is the expression he used, to make sure foreign courts don't prevent flights going to Rwanda, not the one we've seen recently, but under the deportation scheme. Does that include the possibility, then, that that will be in the manifesto, leaving the ECHR?
So I think this is a bit of political sleight of hand, and it's about party management as much as anything else. The Prime Minister wants his party to believe that he would be willing to leave the ECHR. I'm not sure that there really is the appetite to do that inside Number 10. And I think it goes back to where we started on this conversation, that actually it's got entwined with politics, particularly conservative politics, and what conservatism is. And there are some MPs like Jake who say, well, we should leave the ECHR, but we should develop something else. There are other MPs who say, no, just leave it all completely. We don't want to develop anything else. We don't think we need to do that. And I think that's what complicates this conversation. But as far as I understand it, the appetite isn't necessarily there to actually leave.
I mean, is it going to be, then, a big vote winner at the election?
No, there's a reason it's not going to be there, and it's because it's not a vote winner. It's not going to be a vote winner with the people that the Tory party need to vote for them to get through in an election. And that is why Rishi Sunak may talk about it to please people like Jake or other backbenchers he's having difficulties with. But then actually, when it comes to an election, they are not going to run an election based on let's leave the ECHR, because I think that would be a disastrous election for the Tories.
Every time he denigrates our courts, domestic or international, every time he calls them foreign, every time he suggests that a government or a Prime Minister is above the law, he does something damaging to our national discourse, to our democracy.
Does he? I'm not sure I accept that. I think this is a really important debate we should have. And as I say, I don't think it will be in our manifesto. That won't stop people like me going out there and saying, I believe it is the right thing to do, and making the argument. Frankly, that's what you get elected for.
It also won't stop people who hope to be the next Tory Prime Minister or Tory leader, more likely, promising it. I'm pretty sure you will hear from other people like Suella Braverman, potentially others. They're very keen to say to Tory members and Tory MPs that's something they would consider.
You just accused me of launching a Tory leadership bid live on the BBC. I can guarantee you that is not what I...
Sounds like that's what you want to do.
Well, you might as well. It's quite a crowded field.
You have to get someone to nominate and second you. So I think I've fallen down
for about 5 minutes. So.
Yeah, well, hold your breath here, or don't hold your breath. Just have a listen to this. Now, that is a clip of the Israeli entry. You heard a bit of it in the headlines too. The Israeli entry to the Eurovision Song Contest. It's prompted some protests that Israel is there because they're calling for boycotting the Israeli entry and Israel being part of the Eurovision Song Contest. So protesters there. Also, let me introduce our guests. Crystal, a drag artist who is cancelling or has cancelled, I understand, a big ticketed event because Israel is taking part in Eurovision, and freelance journalist Nicole Lampert, who thinks they should be part of Eurovision Song Contest. Thank you both for joining us. Crystal, first of all, why shouldn't Israel be part of Eurovision?
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, you know, I think the claims that the EBU are making that Eurovision is a non-political event are really a non-starter for me. Eurovision has and always will be intrinsically tied to politics, and we've seen that with Russia being justifiably kicked out of the competition in 2022 when they invaded Ukraine, and when Ukraine won in the year that they were invaded as well. You know, politics are intrinsically linked. What we're seeing in Palestine is horrible to witness, and I think is, you know, justification alone for the removal of Israel from the competition. And we're seeing calls from multiple countries, thousands of artists signing letters asking for Israel to be removed. And because that hasn't happened, unfortunately, we've decided to join a boycott.
Nicole?
Hi, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
I find it quite ironic that the West LGBTQ plus community is marching in lockstep with Iran and its proxy Hamas. Iran and Hamas both ban gays and treat women abominably. So that is part of the reason why I think it's, you know, there's this kind of irony that they are together. If we come on to Russia and Ukraine, then in this, if we're going to kind of equate this in any way, then Israel is like Ukraine. Israel was the one that was invaded by Hamas. 1,200 people were killed. And as I'm sure you all know, there's still 130 Israelis still being kept hostage in Gaza. What we're seeing in Gaza is horrendous. This is the fault of Hamas, which started this war and which also hides beneath its own civilians and uses them as human shields and hides in tunnels.
Crystal?
You know, I would just go back to Nicole's first point, which is just real textbook pinkwashing. I refuse as a queer person to let my beloved cultural institutions be used as cover for genocide. And the idea that Palestinian queer rights in Palestine or women's rights in Palestine are going to emerge from a bombing campaign is really laughable. You know, those issues need to come from Palestinians themselves, and I think it's disingenuous to say that, you know, queer rights matter more than the lives of babies who are being bombed right now. You know, my queer politics do not put life over the ability for same-sex marriage, for example. And I think those calls it's really just pinkwashing at its finest, and I don't want to see Eurovision being used in that regard.
Nicole?
Well, I mean, Eurovision is for everybody, and it's obviously not just for the gay community. This idea of pinkwashing is laughable, and it's just a kind of way of attacking Israel for anything good that it does. It's the same with eco-washing, because Israel is at the kind of forefront of the kind of ecological things that will make our planet better. It's the same for Israel's feminism, which is known as colonial feminism, and it's a really good way of ignoring what does go on in many of these countries, including in the Palestinian territories. Of course, as I said, what's going on is horrific. I certainly would like the war to be over as soon as possible. I'd like the hostages returned. And I wish that there wasn't anyone being killed. That this is not the fault of Israel. This is the fault of Hamas, which started this war.
Right. Crystal, why should an Israeli contestant be excluded for the actions of the government in Israel?
You know, it's typical boycott techniques, to be honest with you. You know, we've seen the power of boycott in the past in South Africa with the cultural boycott to end apartheid. And that was a really key lever which helped to end apartheid. So I think the idea that boycotting isn't going to achieve anything isn't right. And I think,
then I suppose,
you know, 59% of people in the UK agree that Israel shouldn't be included in the competition because of their actions. And that just goes to show this is a broad opinion. This is a majority opinion.
The logic of your argument then says, would you also boycott a Palestinian entry, a Palestinian from Gaza taking part in Eurovision because it's run by Hamas, deemed a terrorist organisation by the UK government, which persecutes and sometimes executes its own citizens for homosexuality? Would you boycott a Palestinian entry for the actions of the people who run the area?
Well, I think that's a hypothetical that doesn't exist, sadly, because the Palestinian people don't have a voice. They don't have the ability to participate.
But what would the answer be? The logic of what you're saying is that you should take action.
Obviously, I fundamentally disagree with any government that's going to persecute gay people. And that's, you know, I'm not going to go to Iran anytime soon. So, yes, you know, would I necessarily feel safe? I don't know. But as I say, my politics of queer liberation do not take priority over the right to life.
OK, well, Nicole, conversely, what is wrong with the sort of action being taken by Crystal and calls for a boycott in Eurovision? It's a great platform to express strongly and sincerely held views.
Well, I mean, there is a history, obviously, of Jewish people being boycotted, and that is one of the problems. And of course, the other thing is that we in Europe and in this country, we are Israel's allies. So why would we want to boycott our own ally for striking back at a terrorist attack? It doesn't make any sense unless you are someone who has been taken in by this propaganda being spread by Iran and Hamas and Russia to disrupt this kind of Western alliance. But they are our allies.
Well, have you been taken in, Crystal, very briefly?
I would just say it's not propaganda to say that over 35,000 people have been killed, and most of them are women and children. That isn't a propaganda, and it's a tragedy, and it needs to end. It has to end.
Those figures are literally Hamas figures. Like, you know, no one knows, and even they say they don't know. There's 11,000 names that they're not even sure that they are dead or what they are.
I'm not denying 11,000 from that number. It's still a staggering number.
It is a staggering number, and even if you took away that 15,000 that Israel said are terrorists, it's still a horrific number. This is a war that Hamas started, and it knew what the reaction would be. Like, what do? You don't strike the hornet's nest, do you? What did they think would happen?
I'm going to leave you. Just finish your thought, Nicole, and then we'll leave it.
I was just going to say, you know, Hamas, it deliberately wants its citizens dead. It doesn't care about Palestinians. It hasn't built a single safe room. In the tunnels, only Hamas people are allowed to go.
All right, a final word to Crystal, and then I will end it. But go on, Crystal, what do you say?
You know, I just think what we're hearing right there is an argument for collective punishment, and we're seeing so many innocent people suffering from the actions of a few, and I don't believe that bombing campaigns of innocent people are going to lead to the end of Hamas or to do anything to end this conflict. All it's doing is causing more suffering. And I'm glad that we agree that the suffering is horrible. I fundamentally disagree with the approach.
Thank you to both of you for that interesting discussion. Let me just show you these pictures, because the impact of what we've just heard of the Israel-Hamas conflict is also being felt on some university campuses here. I understand that is Cambridge, and there's been discussions today ongoing about the welfare of Jewish students. These are protesters sitting in an encampment on campus protesting about the Israeli action. But if I just show you this headline in the Times, universities have duty to protect Jewish students, says the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister warns that institutions may face sanctions for failing to act and announces extra funds for Jewish welfare on campus. And this is The Sun. Living in fear. Jewish students are too frightened to go out on campus. Cops must move in to stop anti-Semitism. Should they move in and clear these protests, Jake?
No, I don't think so. I think that students should be free to protest. I mean, it's part of being a young person is often going out and protest. But I do think it's really important that there are limits on it, and I think this increase we've seen in anti-Semitic fear and violence against Jewish students is wrong. Universities owe a duty of care to all of their students, but particularly those in minorities, whether they be Jewish or Muslim or any minority whatsoever, to ensure that they feel safe accessing education.
If they don't feel safe and they're being prevented, as we are hearing reports of, then should these protests be shut down, limited in some way?
Well, I mean, there's already a hell of a lot, as you know, of law that's been passed in recent years to limit peaceful protests. I do agree about the duty of care, but I would also, just for balance, add there are a lot of Jewish students that are involved in these protests too. I think we need to remember that. Just as Mr Netanyahu doesn't speak for the whole of Israel, there are many British Jewish students who feel as strongly as Crystal does about the disproportionate response to the terrible atrocity that was October the 7th.
But we heard from the President for the Union of Jewish Students saying fellow Jewish students are reporting a torrent of abuse on campus, death threats, physical abuse, and some are scared to attend classes. Is this the sort of thing that you're hearing too?
I think there's been a 200% increase on anti-Semitic incidents on campuses over the last year, which is clearly completely unacceptable. I think the reality is that there will always be an area where this crosses over into Jewish students feeling uncomfortable, and it is for universities essentially to step up and manage that. And Jake is right, you know, universities are a place where people can make robust arguments, but there also does need to be a structure to police that.
Thank you very much to all of my guests. That's all we have time for today. I'll be back on Monday, of course, with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye.